In the small, quiet town of Milstone Ridge, Elizabeth Monroe was known as a devoted wife, a local librarian, and someone who rarely raised her voice. She had married Caleb Monroe, a charming but restless contractor, 12 years earlier. To outsiders, they seemed like a stable couple, though those closer to them sensed an underlying tension. Elizabeth often seemed tired, and Caleb's flirtations with younger women were a poorly kept secret. In the spring of 2012, everything unraveled. Caleb accused Elizabeth of attacking him with a kitchen knife after a heated argument. The police report detailed minor cuts on Caleb's arm and a deep scratch across his cheek. Elizabeth insisted it was self-defense, that Caleb had grabbed her first. But the evidence was thin, and Caleb's tearful court testimony painted her as a jealous, violent spouse. With no prior criminal record, Elizabeth still faced harsh charges: aggravated assault and attempted homicide. Caleb, presenting himself as the battered husband, gained public sympathy. Elizabeth's legal defense was weak. Lacking money and betrayed by her own husband's lies, she was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. As the courtroom emptied after sentencing, Caleb smiled quietly to himself. A month later, he sold their house, remarried a much younger woman named Vanessa, and moved into a new custom-built home on the edge of town. Elizabeth, meanwhile, sat behind prison bars, her heart a hollowed-out shell. Betrayed, humiliated, and abandoned, something inside her shifted. The woman who once organized book clubs and bake sales hardened into someone unrecognizable, even to herself. Prison was not kind to Elizabeth. Middleton Correctional Facility was a crumbling institution, underfunded and overcrowded. In her first year, Elizabeth clung to hope, attending group therapy, writing letters to Caleb that were never answered, and volunteering for every rehabilitation program offered. But hope rotted fast in a place like Middleton. When a fight broke out in the cafeteria one afternoon, a tray flying across the room, shouts echoing off the cinderblock walls, Elizabeth was accidentally caught in the chaos. Guards tackled her roughly to the ground, breaking 2 of her ribs. It was her first taste of how the system operated, guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes not even then. The world outside moved on without her. Through bits of gossip from new inmates and the occasional newspaper scrap, Elizabeth pieced together fragments of Caleb's new life. He had opened a second construction business, apparently funded by selling the home they once shared. He and Vanessa had a child together, a daughter named Lily. Pictures of their happy family occasionally surfaced in local papers when Caleb sponsored charity events. Each mention twisted the knife deeper. In therapy sessions, Elizabeth's words grew sparse. Her face, once animated when she spoke of books and students, became unreadable. She learned to listen without speaking, observe without reacting. The lessons of survival hardened into instinct: never show weakness, never trust anyone. By year 3, Elizabeth stopped attending therapy altogether. One night, lying awake in her narrow bunk, Elizabeth realized something chilling. Justice, in its purest form, wasn't coming for her. She would have to create it herself. Slowly, she began studying the habits of the other inmates, the routines of the guards, the gaps in security procedures. It wasn't about escape. It was about understanding control, influence, power, the tools she would one day need. At visitation time, Elizabeth sat behind the glass wall week after week, waiting. But no one came. Not a single friend, not a family member, certainly not Caleb. In that absence, a different kind of relationship grew, not with the outside world, but with her own resolve. She started journaling in coded phrases, hiding her thoughts under innocent-sounding words. The journal became her blueprint, a secret testament to the life she would reclaim once she was free. She no longer thought of Caleb with love. She thought of him with precision, calculation. He had rewritten her life with lies. One day, she would write the ending. By the 6th year of her sentence, Elizabeth had perfected the art of invisibility. She kept her head down, stayed out of fights, and became someone the guards barely noticed. But invisibility had its advantages. She overheard conversations others missed: corrupt staff smuggling in contraband, weaknesses in surveillance patterns, rumors of prisoners planning escapes or settling scores. Meanwhile, Caleb's name came up in news snippets even inmates caught wind of. His second construction company won a lucrative contract with the county to build a new recreation center. The local papers praised him as a model citizen who rebuilt his life after domestic tragedy. Elizabeth studied each piece of information with chilling detachment. She noted his new home address when it was published during a charity event. She memorized the layout of the surrounding streets from old library maps stored in Middleton's forgotten archives. Every detail mattered. Patience would be her greatest weapon. Elizabeth also quietly made herself useful to a few select inmates, running errands, trading favors, sharing carefully gathered information. She didn't form friendships, she formed debts. It wasn't the kind of power that shouted. It whispered, pulling strings quietly. It would serve her when the time came, yet prison time stretched endlessly. Elizabeth often woke gasping from dreams where she was still pleading her innocence to a deaf courtroom, Caleb smiling pityingly from the witness stand. The rage those dreams left behind no longer consumed her. It focused her. Around year 7, a woman named Grace Holloway entered Middleton, a newly incarcerated inmate, a former nurse with a knack for survival. Grace recognized something in Elizabeth that most missed. She approached cautiously, offering quiet companionship without expectation. Their conversations were brief but strategic. Grace had contacts on the outside, family willing to send messages, move money, create opportunities when the time was right. Elizabeth didn't trust easily, but after a year of quiet observation, she allowed Grace into her orbit, not as a friend, but as a tool, an ally, for when she walked free, because Elizabeth's parole hearing was coming, and this time she planned to get out. On the other side of the prison walls, Caleb had no idea. He was busy expanding his empire, polishing his reputation. His daughter Lily was now 8 years old, a bright, giggling child who clung to Caleb's arm in family portraits. Vanessa, too, seemed the perfect wife. Her social media filled with snapshots of charity events, vacations, and holidays. To the world, Caleb was a man who had overcome betrayal. To Elizabeth, he was a man living on borrowed time. Elizabeth approached the parole board like a scholar facing an exam she had spent years preparing for. She rehearsed her statements in her bunk late at night, refining her tone to balance remorse and humility, without ever confessing to a crime she hadn't committed. She knew that anger, even righteous anger, would only confirm what Caleb's lies had already cemented in public opinion, that she was dangerous. On the morning of the hearing, Elizabeth's appearance was carefully curated. Her hair, graying at the temples, was pulled neatly back. No makeup, it would seem manipulative. She wore the simple, modest prison-issued uniform, pressed as best she could. Her hands stayed folded in her lap to hide the tremor she could not entirely suppress. The 3-member board sat behind a battered wooden table, leafing through her file. A prosecutor, a man who hadn't even been involved in her original trial, presented the state's case with a detached efficiency, recommending denial. They always did. Elizabeth listened without outward emotion. When asked to speak, she rose with measured calm. She acknowledged her conviction without admitting guilt, spoke of her work in the prison library, her good behavior, her counseling sessions. Not once did she mention Caleb's name. The hearing ended in less than an hour. Parole decisions were rarely immediate. Elizabeth returned to her cell knowing she would wait days, maybe weeks, for the answer that would shape the rest of her life. In the meantime, she contacted Grace's outside connections. A letter, folded 3 times and written in a coded mixture of biblical references and nursery rhymes, was smuggled out. It contained simple but clear instructions. Begin gathering supplies. Nothing extravagant. Cash, a used car, clean clothing, a prepaid cell phone, tools of anonymity, not for a flashy escape, but for quiet mobility. Across town, Caleb was celebrating another success. The recreation center his company had built was hosting its grand opening, drawing local politicians and media. Photographs captured Caleb shaking hands with council members, Vanessa smiling graciously at his side, Lily holding a giant pair of scissors for the ribbon cutting. No one spoke of Elizabeth anymore. In Caleb's mind, she had been buried by time and distance. But in a dim cell at Middleton Correctional, Elizabeth waited. waited for a decision, waited for a signal, waited for the day when silence would no longer be her weapon, when action would speak instead. When the parole decision came 3 weeks later, it was delivered in a plain envelope, slipped through the narrow slot in her cell door. Elizabeth opened it with steady hands. Parole granted. She closed her eyes for a long moment, breathing in the finality of it. In less than 30 days, she would walk out of Middleton for good. Freedom was within reach. So was Caleb. The final weeks inside Middleton passed with agonizing slowness. Every sound, the clank of cell doors, the barked orders from guards, the muttered conversations of inmates, felt distant, already a memory in the making. Elizabeth moved through the routines with mechanical efficiency. She avoided trouble, stayed invisible, and said nothing that could be twisted or reported back. Meanwhile, Grace's contacts sent coded confirmation. The preparations were underway. Elizabeth's post-release package would be modest, just enough to allow her to move without immediately attracting attention. A battered blue sedan had been purchased under a false name. A second-hand cell phone waited, prepaid and untraceable. A small envelope of cash, no more than a few $1,000s, was secured at a designated drop point outside the city. Elizabeth wasn't planning chaos. She was planning precision. The day of release dawned gray and cold. There was no ceremony, no warm goodbyes. She changed into donated clothing, jeans, a plain sweater, sneakers too large for her feet, and stepped into the blinding freedom of an empty parking lot. No one was there to meet her, exactly as planned. She didn't look back at Middleton Correctional. It was dead to her now. Instead, Elizabeth headed for the nearest bus station. She kept her head down, blending in among the tired faces and worn-out bodies drifting through the morning. When the time was right, she retrieved the car and cash from the drop location without incident. For the first time in nearly a decade, Elizabeth was untethered. But she wasn't lost. Her first destination wasn't Caleb's house. It was the outskirts of Milstone Ridge, a cheap motel hidden on an old highway that few people used anymore. She rented a room under the name Claire Holloway, a nod to Grace's help, and spent the next days establishing herself, buying new clothes at thrift stores, eating in out-of-the-way diners, watching the town from a safe distance. She learned that Caleb's company had grown bigger than she realized, now employing over 50 people. His home was a grand 2-story house on Elmhurst Lane, with a broad lawn and security cameras dotting the eaves. He hosted backyard parties, threw holiday barbecues, and was a deacon at the local church. Caleb had built a fortress of respectability. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in charging the gates. She was interested in finding the cracks. Elizabeth spent her first week of freedom learning Caleb's routines with the patience of a seasoned hunter. She rented the motel room by the week, using cash. She moved through town at odd hours, wearing nondescript clothing, her hair tucked under hats or scarves. Always moving, always watching. She learned that Caleb left his house each morning at 7:45 sharp, driving Lily to a private school across town before heading to his construction firm's main office. Vanessa, meanwhile, spent her mornings at a boutique gym, followed by brunches with the same circle of women Elizabeth remembered from years ago. Gossipers who had once whispered about Elizabeth's mental instability during the trial. By late afternoon, the house stood empty most days. Security cameras faced the street, but Elizabeth quickly spotted blind spots. Areas behind the detached garage, parts of the backyard shielded by overgrown shrubbery. It wasn't a fortress. Not really. It just looked like one. Elizabeth didn't rush. She was no longer the woman who acted out of wounded pride or raw emotion. Every step she took now was calculated, measured, designed to feel inevitable once it happened. At night, she sat on the motel bed with a battered notebook, sketching floor plans of Caleb's house based on public real estate listings and what she could observe from a distance. She compiled lists, alarm companies, security schedules, known associates, casual acquaintances. She documented the habits of the town, when the streets were busiest, when they were quietest, how long police took to respond to alarms in different neighborhoods. Slowly, a plan took shape. One afternoon, she noticed something new. Caleb was spending an increasing amount of time alone. The once perfect image of the Monroe family seemed to have fractures. At a local coffee shop, Elizabeth overheard one of Vanessa's friends complaining that Caleb was always working late, that Vanessa had been venting about the strain on their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on Elizabeth. The man who had destroyed her over an imagined betrayal was now betraying someone else, or at the very least, setting the stage for it. She saw opportunity in those cracks. People isolated themselves when they felt ashamed. They grew careless, vulnerable. Elizabeth didn't want Caleb dead yet. First, she wanted him to feel what she had felt, powerless, abandoned, invisible. She began small, a series of anonymous phone calls made to his office, heavy breathing, then silence. A carefully planted rumor about financial irregularities at his company, whispered to a local journalist under the pretense of an old employee tip. Nothing that pointed to her, just enough to make the walls of his perfect life shudder, to sow discomfort and doubt. Meanwhile, she continued to refine the final phase of her plan, one that wouldn't just hurt Caleb. It would destroy the image he'd built for himself piece by piece. When Elizabeth looked at Caleb's smiling face on the firm's website, she didn't see a man anymore. She saw a crumbling structure, and she knew exactly where to apply the pressure next. The first signs of trouble in Caleb's world were small, easy to dismiss. The unsettling calls to his office were chalked up to pranksters. The rumors about financial irregularities were treated like gossip, spreading quietly but without immediate damage. But small cracks grow, and Elizabeth was relentless in widening them. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, she slipped a plain manila envelope into the mailbox of Caleb's company headquarters. Inside, a copy of a decade-old court transcript, his own testimony against her, highlighted and annotated with thin red pen. No signature, no return address. That night, Caleb sat alone in his home office, reading the transcript with trembling hands. Vanessa found him hours later, staring blankly into the fireplace, the papers spread across his lap. He told her it was nothing, just old paperwork he needed to review. But paranoia took root. He changed the locks on their house without telling Vanessa. He installed additional security cameras around the property. He became short-tempered with employees, firing 2 on flimsy accusations of disloyalty. He snapped at Vanessa during a charity event so viciously that several board members began quietly discussing his erratic behavior. Elizabeth watched it all unfold, blending easily into the town's background. A face in a diner, a passerby at the gas station, a customer browsing thrift store shelves. She was careful never to get too close, not yet. Instead, she planted more seeds. She anonymously mailed copies of Caleb's oldest unpaid fines, traffic tickets, old civil complaints from subcontractors, to the local newspaper under the guise of an anonymous tip. A small article ran on the back page. Local builders' questionable past financial dealings come to light. Nothing devastating, but reputation was everything in a town like Milstone Ridge. And Caleb's shiny veneer was beginning to tarnish. One night, under the cover of a heavy fog, Elizabeth tested her reach further. She parked her car 2 streets over and slipped through Caleb's neighborhood on foot. Dressed in black, moving through the backyard's blind spots she had memorized, she reached the fence line of his property without triggering a single motion light. There, half hidden by the darkness, she carved a single word into the wooden slats of the fence facing the woods. Liar. It wasn't large. It wasn't even immediately visible from the house, but it was visible enough that when Caleb walked the perimeter the next morning, he found it. Elizabeth imagined the moment he stood there reading it. The word a brand on his carefully curated life. The trap was tightening, and Caleb didn't even realize he was stepping deeper into it with every paranoid choice he made. By the end of autumn, the stress was beginning to show on Caleb's face, deep lines carved along his mouth and brow, a permanent tension in his shoulders. Vanessa, once his tireless supporter, was growing distant. Their arguments, once rare and private, were now sharp enough that neighbors overheard them through open windows. Elizabeth watched from afar, patient and cold. But she knew observation alone wouldn't finish what she had started. It was time for something bolder, something personal. She crafted a new identity, an alias named Lena Carter, Armed with a cheap blonde wig, reading glasses, and second-hand business attire, she applied for a part-time bookkeeping job Caleb's company had posted online. The irony wasn't lost on her. If Caleb had reviewed applicants personally, he might have seen through the disguise. But success had made him lazy, arrogant. The interviews were handled by his second-in-command, a harried office manager who barely glanced at Elizabeth's references before hiring her. On a cold Tuesday morning, Elizabeth stepped into Caleb's office building for the first time in over a decade. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, something inside her shifted. She wasn't scared. She wasn't bitter. She was home. The office was larger than she remembered, filled with polished floors, glass partitions, and cheap motivational posters. Caleb's name was emblazoned proudly across the front entrance: Monroe Construction and Design. Elizabeth kept her head low, performed her tasks efficiently, and made herself invisible among the small staff. She sat through morning meetings, filed invoices, balanced ledgers, always watching, always listening. Caleb walked past her desk 3 times that first week without recognizing her. He was distracted, snapping at employees for minor mistakes, obsessively checking the security cameras linked to his phone. He muttered to himself when he thought no one was listening. Elizabeth noted every telltale sign. Caleb was unraveling faster than she had anticipated. From her position inside, Elizabeth gathered deeper intelligence: schedules, security codes, financial data. She learned that Caleb kept a separate phone, hidden from Vanessa, used for communication with someone Elizabeth suspected was another woman. Hypocrisy piled atop betrayal. Late one evening, after everyone else had gone home, Elizabeth sat alone in the dim office. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. She stood outside Caleb's private office door, keycard in hand, pulse steady. Inside, the room was cold, sterile, family photos on the desk, awards on the walls. Behind the neatly organized bookshelf, a safe bolted into the wall, Caleb's emergency stash, according to the whispered conversations Elizabeth had overheard. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she left a single object in the middle of his desk. An old, faded photograph of herself from their early years together, smiling, innocent, unaware of the disaster he would one day unleash on her life. No note, no fingerprints, just the photo. A ghost from the past, staring him straight in the face. The next morning, Caleb found it. Witnesses later said he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, clutching the edge of his desk with trembling hands. He canceled all meetings for the day. He changed the locks again. He started carrying a concealed weapon, illegally, inside his jacket. But none of that would save him. Elizabeth was already inside his walls, and she was just getting started. The office grew colder as winter settled over Milstone Ridge. The tension inside Monroe Construction and Design was almost visible, a crackling static that buzzed through every hallway and whispered through every meeting. Caleb grew increasingly volatile. Small mistakes from employees triggered disproportionate rages. Entire teams were fired or replaced. Those who remained walked on eggshells, terrified of making themselves a target. Rumors of his mental decline leaked into the town's social circles, where hushed voices speculated about breakdowns and substance abuse. Elizabeth fed those rumors carefully, like oxygen to a slow-burning fire. She fabricated anonymous complaints to city regulators about permit irregularities. She staged a missing invoice scandal that led to a temporary freeze on one of Caleb's key projects. Every move was small enough to seem coincidental, but together, they painted a picture of incompetence and instability. And Caleb felt it closing in. He stopped attending public events. He pulled Lily out of private school, claiming safety concerns. He accused Vanessa of conspiring against him, triggering brutal arguments behind the locked doors of their once proud home. Vanessa, worn thin by months of tension, began packing her things quietly. Elizabeth, ever patient, waited. She needed Vanessa to leave on her own, not by force, but by Caleb's own hand. It happened one bleak December morning. Caleb arrived home early from work, paranoid after a minor confrontation with a city inspector. He found Vanessa speaking softly on the phone in the kitchen, her voice too low to hear. Without evidence, without sense, Caleb exploded, accusing her of betrayal, of spying for his enemies, of stealing from him. The fight ended with Vanessa shoving her wedding ring into Caleb's chest and walking out the door, dragging a single suitcase behind her. She didn't take Lily. She didn't even look back. Neighbors heard the shouting but said nothing. Elizabeth watched it unfold from a parked car half a block away, hidden under a knitted cap and dark glasses. She didn't smile. There was no satisfaction yet. This was only the next step. Now Caleb was truly alone. Within days, the foreclosure notices arrived. The fines and penalties Elizabeth had orchestrated behind the scenes coming due all at once. A lawsuit from a disgruntled subcontractor gained traction. Investors began pulling out quietly, unwilling to tie themselves to a sinking ship. Elizabeth, working late one night at the office, listened to Caleb on the phone through the thin walls of his office. His voice was desperate, pleading, begging for extensions, begging for second chances, but no one was listening anymore. Elizabeth carefully filed the month's invoices into the system, finished her coffee, and left the building with the satisfaction of a surgeon completing a slow, meticulous operation. The empire Caleb had built atop her sacrifice was crumbling. And still, he had no idea who was wielding the scalpel. Not yet. The first snowfall dusted Milstone Ridge in early January, blanketing the town in a deceptive quiet. Inside his once proud home, Caleb sat in the dark, blinds drawn, whiskey glass sweating on the armrest of his recliner. He jumped at every creak of the house, every car door slamming outside, every unexpected ring of the phone. He was a man waiting for a blow he couldn't see coming. Elizabeth spent her days tightening the noose. She fed Caleb's growing paranoia with small, surgical moves, tampering with minor accounting figures to suggest embezzlement, leaking a forged letter implying an impending IRS audit. Each whisper pushed Caleb deeper into his own mind, feeding a narrative that he was under siege from unseen enemies. And then came the final phase. Elizabeth planted a single email. Sent from a dummy account to Caleb's personal inbox, the message was brief. "You took everything. Now it's your turn to lose." No signature, no demand, just a statement of fact. Caleb's reaction was immediate. He smashed his office laptop, accused 3 different employees of betrayal, and finally, inevitably, fired the entire front office staff, including Elizabeth under her alias. But by then, she had everything she needed. Elizabeth didn't fight the termination. She didn't even flinch. She packed her few belongings from the desk with the calm of a woman watching the last piece of a carefully arranged domino chain fall exactly as expected. As she left, Caleb, red-eyed, disheveled, almost unrecognizable, stormed out of his office, brushing past her without a second glance. Elizabeth stood just outside the glass doors for a moment, the freezing wind tugging at her jacket. Then she turned and walked away, unnoticed. The town noticed Caleb's unraveling, though. Rumors spread faster now, not about his business failings, but about his mental health. People spoke in low voices at the grocery store and the gas station, speculating about drug use, secret debts, hidden affairs. Caleb, once Milstone Ridge's golden son, was now a ghost haunting his own life. At night, he roamed his cavernous house alone. The security system beeped endlessly from low batteries he didn't bother to replace. Rooms once filled with laughter and light now sat dark, abandoned, thick with the smell of neglect. Elizabeth watched from a distance, her patience infinite, but patience had an expiration date. The real confrontation was no longer a question of if, only when and how. On the evening of January 24th, Elizabeth made her final preparations. She purchased a new disposable phone, separate from the one she had used for months. She sent a single message to Caleb's private number, the one he thought no one knew about. A simple instruction: come to the house, alone, midnight. There was no threat, there was no demand. But Caleb, broken and terrified, obeyed. Because by then, Caleb understood something deep in his marrow. Whoever was hunting him wasn't after money or fame. They were after him. Elizabeth stood across the street from Caleb's house that night, watching the upstairs window glow faintly. She could see Caleb pacing, shadowed and frantic. He would come. And when he did, Elizabeth wouldn't hide anymore. The story he had written with lies 10 years ago was about to end, written in blood. The clock in Caleb's barren living room ticked toward midnight. each second louder than the last. Outside, the world was silent, frozen under a blanket of snow. The wind rattled the bare branches of the trees, tapping against the dark windows like skeletal fingers. Caleb sat rigid in his chair, dressed in a heavy jacket, his hand wrapped around the cold grip of a pistol. He hadn't eaten all day. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. He watched the front door like a man waiting for his own execution. At 11:57 p.m., the motion sensor light at the end of the driveway flickered on. Caleb jerked upright, heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, he thought about calling the police, but deep down, he knew it was too late for that. Some debts had to be paid in person. He tucked the gun into the waistband of his jeans and staggered to the door. When he opened it, the winter air slapped him in the face, clearing his fogged mind just enough to recognize the figure standing at the edge of the porch. Elizabeth. No wig, no disguise, no mask. Just Elizabeth, older, leaner, her eyes stripped of anything resembling warmth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Elizabeth tilted her head slightly, studying him like a scientist examining a failed experiment. "You," he finally croaked, the gun shaking in his hand. Elizabeth stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them with deliberate steps. "You should put that down," she said quietly, her voice steady as stone. "You won't get the chance to use it." Caleb's grip tightened instinctively. "You're supposed to be—" His voice broke, as if the word itself, gone, refused to come out. Elizabeth smiled then, but it was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of inevitability. "I was," she said simply, "and now I'm not." The porch light flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. Caleb backed into the house, waving the gun in a shaky arc. "Stay back," he hissed. Elizabeth followed him inside, closing the door gently behind her. The house was silent except for the hum of the heating system struggling against the bitter cold. Elizabeth's eyes swept the room, the empty liquor bottles, the piles of unopened mail, the dust-covered trophies of Caleb's former life. "You built this on my bones," she said softly, "and now it's all you have left." Caleb's fear twisted into rage. "You tried to kill me!" he shouted. "You're crazy! You always were!" Elizabeth didn't flinch. "You lied!" she corrected him, her voice sharp as a knife. "You lied to save yourself! You destroyed me to build this pathetic little kingdom!" Caleb's breathing was ragged now, his chest heaving. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice slipping into pleading. "We can fix this! We can—" "No," Elizabeth said, stepping closer. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, gleaming object. Not a gun, but something heavier, grimmer. An axe, the old kind. Wooden handle, freshly sharpened. Caleb's eyes widened in horror. "Elizabeth, don't!" The axe glinted in the low light. "You took everything," she whispered, "and now I'm taking it back." She raised the axe slowly, deliberately, no hesitation, no mercy. The last thing Caleb saw before the blade came down was Elizabeth's face, calm, cold, and unbroken. The sound of the first blow echoed through the empty house like a gunshot, and then there was only silence. The house was so quiet after it was over that Elizabeth could hear her own breath. She stood over Caleb's body, the axe slipping from her fingers and landing with a muted thud on the hardwood floor. Blood pooled slowly across the floorboards, creeping outward like a dark, silent tide. Elizabeth didn't tremble. She didn't cry. The years had drained all emotion from this moment. She wiped her gloved hands carefully with a cloth she had brought for this purpose and tucked it back into her jacket. Every move was clinical, practiced, the actions of someone who had lived this scene 1,000 times already in her mind. She took nothing from the house, no trophies, no souvenirs. This wasn't about keeping pieces of Caleb. This was about erasing the piece of herself that had once loved him. Elizabeth moved quickly. She left the house through the back door, cutting through the alleyways and wooded lots she had memorized during her months of surveillance. Within 15 minutes, she was back at her parked car, an old sedan with plates registered to a shell identity she had created months earlier. She drove calmly, obeying every traffic law, her heart rate steady. The plan was simple: disappear before the body was found. In the morning, Caleb's absence would become conspicuous. Employees would find the office locked, his phone unanswered. Someone, a concerned neighbor maybe, would eventually call the police after noticing the unopened mail, the stillness of the house. By then, Elizabeth would be gone. At a roadside motel 2 towns over, she had already paid cash for a room under another alias. She changed clothes in the bathroom, burning the blood-stained jacket and gloves in a steel trash barrel behind a service station off a rural highway. By dawn, Elizabeth Monroe no longer existed in Milstone Ridge. The woman who crossed the state line that morning was someone else entirely. She didn't look back. Back in Milstone Ridge, the discovery unfolded predictably. A maintenance worker from the electric company arrived mid-morning to address a reported outage in the area. When no one answered the door at Caleb's home and the exterior appeared abandoned, he peered through a window and saw the unmistakable smear of blood across the floor. Police were called immediately. Detectives from the small-town department entered the home cautiously, guns drawn, expecting a burglary gone wrong. What they found instead was a scene that would haunt them for years. Caleb Monroe, prominent businessman and public figure, brutally murdered in his own living room. The initial theories focused on a robbery or revenge by disgruntled former employees. After all, Caleb had recently fired almost his entire office staff under suspicious circumstances. Fingerprints were scarce. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing of value had been stolen. The town, still reeling from the slow public collapse of Caleb's empire, now faced the shocking conclusion: someone had hated him enough to kill him in cold blood. Detectives found the security system disabled, the cameras inside wiped clean. Whoever had done this had been careful, professional even. They built their case slowly, but nothing pointed clearly to any suspect. And Elizabeth, halfway across the state in a nameless diner, sipped weak coffee from a chipped mug and read the headlines with detached interest. Prominent builder found slain in home. No suspects yet. She folded the newspaper and placed it on the counter. The end of Caleb Monroe was front-page news, exactly as it should be. The early days of the investigation were chaotic. Local law enforcement scrambled to piece together the murder scene, but they quickly realized they were in over their heads. The brutality of Caleb's death, the use of an axe, the precise disabling of the security systems, suggested a personal motive rather than random violence. Detective Alan Reese, a seasoned but weary officer nearing retirement, was assigned to lead the case. He stood in Caleb's gutted living room, glancing between bloodstains and broken furniture, his instincts telling him this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was something colder, sharper, planned. Reese compiled a list of potential suspects: disgruntled employees, angry investors, estranged family members. He interviewed Caleb's former staff, those few who hadn't scattered after being fired, but most had airtight alibis. Vanessa was questioned too, her bitterness obvious, but she had been 200 miles away at the time, verified by hotel records. The investigation dragged. Meanwhile, Elizabeth kept moving. She rented cheap motels under different names, staying no more than 2 nights in any one place. She bought used clothes from second-hand shops and paid for everything in cash. She avoided cameras, banks, and highways, choosing back roads and bus stations no one remembered. Each day she traveled deeper into anonymity, shedding pieces of the life she had once known. But even in her calculated caution, Elizabeth knew something. No plan was perfect. Detective Reese's team reviewed Caleb's finances, looking for irregularities. That's when they stumbled across a strange employment record: Alina Carter, who had worked briefly as a bookkeeper at Monroe Construction. Her references were fake, her background check shallow. Initially dismissed as a clerical oversight, the record became more interesting when surveillance footage from Caleb's office, recovered from a nearby storage server, showed Lena Carter's face, blurred, grainy, but visible. The footage wasn't enough for immediate identification, but it planted a seed of doubt in Reese's mind. Who was this woman? Why had she appeared in Caleb's life during its final unraveling? And where had she gone? Reese issued a quiet inquiry to surrounding counties, checking for matching aliases, hotel registries, and employment records. It was a small thread, but it was enough to start pulling. Back in a small rented room above a shuttered gas station 2 towns south, Elizabeth sat on a thin mattress, staring at a tattered road map. She marked possible routes with a blunt pencil, planning her next move farther west. Her goal wasn't a new life with a new name. There would be no long future for her. Elizabeth knew she was living on borrowed time, the same way Caleb had lived for years. But until the end came, she would savor something Caleb never could: freedom, in its purest, coldest form. Winter dragged on, harsh and endless, making every motel room Elizabeth stayed in feel colder, more temporary. She kept moving, west, south, wherever anonymity seemed thickest. Small towns, roadside diners, forgotten back roads. She worked odd jobs under cash-only arrangements, cleaning motel rooms, stocking grocery shelves at midnight, washing dishes in truck stop kitchens, never staying more than a few weeks, never making friends. Elizabeth felt the first tremor of real danger 2 months after Caleb's death. She was sweeping floors in a grimy diner outside of Redford when a state trooper walked in, not unusual by itself. But the way he lingered near the register, casually glancing at each worker, made her skin tighten. He pinned a photo to the wall, one of several missing persons notices. But Elizabeth caught a flash of text, seeking information related to Monroe case. The photo wasn't of her, not yet. But it was a warning all the same. The investigation was widening. She left Redford that night, abandoning a week's wages still owed, heading deeper into the rural highways where no one asked questions unless you gave them reason. Back in Milstone Ridge, Detective Reese was methodically building his case. Slowly, painfully, he constructed a profile of Lena Carter, the woman who had appeared just as Caleb's empire began to crumble. Cross-referencing employment records with DMV photos, he found a partial match to an old prison ID, Elizabeth Monroe. The discovery was like ice water down his spine. Reese pulled the old court files from Elizabeth's trial, reading through the manufactured testimony, the weak defense, the brittle pieces that hadn't fit together even then. He saw it clearly now, a miscarriage of justice buried under charm, reputation, and public perception. Elizabeth had spent nearly 10 years behind bars for a crime she hadn't committed. And now, Caleb Monroe was dead. Reese didn't believe in coincidences. But belief wasn't evidence. He needed proof, a face-to-face interview, a direct connection between Elizabeth and Caleb's murder. He filed a quiet warrant, nothing public yet, and began combing records for sightings of Elizabeth under her known aliases. Meanwhile, Elizabeth set up temporary shelter in a trailer park outside a town so small it barely registered on a map. The owner accepted her cash without questions. She was Anna, a woman with no past, but the cracks were forming even here. A nosy neighbor knocked one night, offering a pie and too many questions about where she came from. A clerk at the grocery store squinted at her too long, like trying to remember where he'd seen her face before. Elizabeth packed her few belongings that night: 2 changes of clothes, a fake ID, a crumpled envelope of cash, and slipped away before sunrise. She was tired, bone-deep tired. Running was a young person's game, and Elizabeth wasn't young anymore. Still, there was no regret. Freedom, even hunted and fraying at the edges, tasted sweeter than all the years she had spent caged. She found another town, another false name, another fragile shelter from the coming storm. But somewhere in the distance, closer now, Elizabeth could feel it, the slow, inevitable approach of footsteps. And this time, they were coming for her. The town of Fairmont was supposed to be another stopover, a nameless speck on a map where Elizabeth could catch her breath. She rented a small room above a defunct gas station, cleaned herself up, and found work under the table at a roadside laundromat. For a few weeks, it was enough. She kept to herself, made no friends, left no trace. She wore cheap sunglasses indoors. She paid cash for everything. She avoided cameras. But something about Fairmont gnawed at her. It was too small. People noticed faces in small towns, faces that didn't belong. One morning, she caught a woman at the laundromat staring at her a little too long. An old man asked where she was from, and Elizabeth's lie came too slowly, the hesitation clear in her voice. She packed that night, but it was already too late. Back in Milstone Ridge, Detective Reese sat in a cluttered office, a stack of files spread across his desk like a battlefield. He had enough circumstantial evidence to move forward. The false employment at Monroe Construction, the timeline aligning perfectly, Elizabeth's parole status and disappearance shortly after Caleb's death. Still, it wasn't airtight. Reese needed Elizabeth's location before he could put together a warrant that would hold. Through DMV pings, motel registries, and low-level information gathering, he narrowed it down. Sightings of a woman matching Elizabeth's rough description in scattered towns across 3 states. Fairmont was one of them. He sent a local deputy, posing as a gas station customer, to quietly take a few photos of the woman working nights at the laundromat. The grainy photo that arrived on Reese's phone was enough. Elizabeth Monroe had been found. Elizabeth felt it in the air before she saw it. The night after she decided to leave Fairmont, she spotted a sedan idling too long across from the laundromat. 2 men inside. Pretending not to notice, she finished folding a customer's laundry with mechanical slowness, her mind racing. She was tired. She was careful, but she wasn't invisible anymore. As soon as the shift ended, she ducked out the back entrance, cutting through an overgrown lot toward the trailer where she had stashed her things. Within minutes, she was on the road, driving a rusted pickup truck she had bought 2 weeks earlier from a local farmer. No paperwork attached, no headlights, no phone, no GPS, only instinct. Behind her, the police moved, slower, more cautious than she expected. They didn't want to spook her into disappearing completely. But Elizabeth had spent 10 years learning how to disappear, and she was good at it. She abandoned the truck 2 towns over, slipping into the bus station just as dawn broke, buying a one-way ticket to nowhere in particular. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was survival. Detective Reese cursed when he received the call. "She's gone," the deputy said. "Vanished. Locals say she packed in the middle of the night." Reese knew what that meant. Elizabeth was running, and this time, there might not be a second chance to catch her. He issued a regional bolo, be on the lookout, for a woman in her 40s, traveling alone, likely under fake names. No direct accusation yet, no official mention of Caleb Monroe, but the walls were closing in. Elizabeth had made her move, and so had Reese. The hunt was no longer quiet. It was open, and it would end, one way or another. The bus rumbled west through flat, open country, empty fields stretching endlessly in every direction. Elizabeth sat near the back, hood drawn over her face, pretending to sleep. Every bump in the road jostled her frayed nerves. Every stop felt like a potential trap. Every boarding passenger was a possible end. She knew she couldn't keep running like this, not much longer. Her money was almost gone. Her false IDs were thinning out. Her body, hardened by years of survival, was finally beginning to betray her with exhaustion and the cold stiffness of too many nights sleeping upright or on floors. But Elizabeth wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. Detective Reese was now fully committed. The bolo produced a handful of leads, mostly false, but one call stood out. A bus depot manager 2 counties west flagged a woman matching Elizabeth's description buying a one-way ticket in cash. The ticket pointed to a town called Mayfield, another small, forgettable place barely hanging onto the map. Reese gathered a small task force and moved immediately. No more slow strategy. Elizabeth was slipping further with every hour. This time, they would close the net. Elizabeth stepped off the bus into the brittle morning air of Mayfield. The town was even smaller than she expected. A handful of cracked sidewalks, boarded-up shops, and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. Perfect, and impossible. In a town this small, a stranger might as well be wearing a neon sign. She couldn't stay here, couldn't rest. Elizabeth walked for hours, cutting through alleyways and slipping behind abandoned buildings, trying to stay invisible. She needed a new plan, a final plan. She couldn't run to another town. They would follow. She couldn't go to ground permanently, not without money, not without help. Options narrowed like a noose tightening around her throat. By dusk, she found herself near an old train yard, mostly deserted, used only for occasional freight traffic. It was a place out of time, rusted tracks, graffiti-stained cars, the air heavy with the smell of oil and iron. Elizabeth slipped between the cars, finding shelter beneath one of the boxcars. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and waited, heart pounding against her ribs. Above her, the twilight bled into full darkness. She didn't know it, but law enforcement had already set up roadblocks on the only 2 highways leading out of Mayfield. Detective Reese arrived an hour later, tired but sharp, directing the perimeter search with quiet efficiency. "We close this off tight," he told his team. "She's here somewhere." He wasn't motivated by anger, not even by justice. It was inevitability now. Gravity. Elizabeth had written her ending the moment she stepped back into Milstone Ridge. Now they would all just play their parts. Under the boxcar, Elizabeth pressed her forehead against her knees and let her mind drift. She thought of the life she might have had. A simple one. Mornings at the library, holidays with Caleb, a quiet, aging peace. That life had died long ago, in a courtroom filled with lies. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even sad. She was simply tired. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the sharp beams of flashlights were cutting through the darkness nearby. They were getting closer. The beams of flashlights grew sharper, their edges cutting into the darkness like knives. Elizabeth stayed pressed against the cold metal of the boxcar, breathing shallowly, her body aching from cold and fear. She heard footsteps crunching gravel nearby, steady, methodical, no running, no shouting. Just the slow, deliberate movements of men who knew their quarry had nowhere left to go. Above her, a voice called out, amplified through a loudspeaker. "Elizabeth Monroe, we know you're here. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." She closed her eyes against the sound, pressing her forehead to the steel undercarriage. The voice wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was tired, just like her. For a long moment, Elizabeth remained still. Part of her, the feral part that had kept her alive all these months, screamed to run, to fight, to vanish into the cracks again. But there were no cracks left, and she was tired of running. Slowly, with stiff, frozen hands, she pushed herself upright and crawled out from under the boxcar. The cold night air slapped her exposed skin. The beams of a dozen flashlights swung toward her like accusing fingers. She didn't raise her hands immediately. Instead, she stood for a moment in the center of the abandoned train yard, letting them see her, unarmed, broken, but unbowed. Detective Reese stepped forward, lowering his loudspeaker. "Elizabeth," he said, voice low enough to barely carry over the hum of the generators powering their mobile units. "It's over." Elizabeth looked at him across the distance. In that moment, she didn't see a cop, a hunter, a threat. She saw a man as tired as she was. The cold crept deeper into her bones, but she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. She raised her hands slowly, deliberately. Officers moved in cautiously, shouting standard commands, but Elizabeth didn't resist when they pulled her arms behind her back and snapped the handcuffs into place. As they led her away, Elizabeth didn't look back at the rusting skeletons of the trains, or the wide, empty fields beyond. She had already left all of it behind the moment she walked into Caleb's house that night. Detective Reese watched from a distance as Elizabeth was loaded into the back of a squad car. There was no victory in it. No satisfaction, only a deep, gnawing sadness. He had read the old court transcripts. He had seen the holes, the lies, the injustice that had swallowed her whole. But the law didn't bend for broken lives. It only recorded their endings. Elizabeth would face trial again. Only this time, there would be no sympathy, no second chances. Reese knew she wouldn't beg. She would walk into court wearing the same cold, quiet dignity she wore now, and she would accept whatever verdict they gave her. Not because she believed in their justice, but because, in her own way, she had already delivered hers. In the squad car, Elizabeth leaned her head against the window, feeling the handcuffs bite into her wrists. Outside, the horizon bled into a lighter shade of gray. Morning was coming. She had made it longer than she should have. She had seen Caleb fall. She had seen justice, raw and imperfect, delivered by her own hands. And now, she would pay the price. There was a strange peace in that, an ending she could live with, for however long she had left. Elizabeth's trial began 6 months later. Held in a neighboring county far from Milstone Ridge, it was a muted affair compared to the media circus some had expected. Time had dulled the public's memory of Caleb Monroe's supposed greatness, and the details of Elizabeth's conviction years earlier had begun to cast long shadows over his reputation. Still, the facts were brutal and undeniable. Caleb Monroe had been murdered with an axe. Elizabeth had fled the scene and evaded capture for months. The prosecution didn't dwell on motive. They didn't need to. Motive was obvious, even to those who only skimmed the headlines. Elizabeth's defense team, a pair of exhausted public defenders assigned by the court, attempted to present her past as context, not justification. They spoke quietly of betrayal, of injustice, of a life stolen and rebuilt out of necessity rather than choice. But the law did not reward tragedy. It only judged actions. When the verdict was read, Elizabeth stood without flinching. Guilty. Sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst, no pleas for mercy, no tears. Elizabeth simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth she had long since accepted. Detective Reese attended the sentencing quietly, sitting in the back row, his badge tucked away. He watched Elizabeth as she was led out of the courtroom, her steps steady, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of that place. There was no triumph in the moment, no justice that could erase what had been taken from her. There was only the final accounting of choices made long ago, by Caleb, by Elizabeth, by a system that had failed them both in different ways. As Elizabeth disappeared through the heavy double doors, Reese closed his eyes for a long moment. He would retire 2 months later. Not because of Elizabeth, but because some stories stayed with a man longer than he could bear. Elizabeth adjusted quickly to prison life. It was not the same as Middleton Correctional had been a decade earlier. She was older now, and the edge she had sharpened over the years had dulled into something quieter, more patient. She worked in the prison library. She kept to herself. She marked time by the seasons, the shifting light through the high, narrow windows, the change in the taste of the air. There were no visits, no letters. The world outside moved on without her. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth found a strange, bitter peace in knowing she owed it nothing. She had done what needed to be done, not for revenge, not for glory, but for closure. For the small, stubborn voice inside her that refused to let Caleb's lies be the final word. Sometimes at night, she would sit by the narrow cell window and look at the stars. There was no real freedom in those stars, only the memory of it. But that was enough. Enough to remind her that once, for a little while, she had reclaimed her own story. And though the world would never tell it her way, Elizabeth knew the truth. She had survived. She had fought, and in the end, she had chosen her own ending, not the one written for her, not the one handed down by liars or judges, her own.